It was November 23rd, 1937, inside a makeshift recording studio on the third floor of a warehouse in Dallas, Texas. The air hung thick with anticipation and something else, something the engineers couldn't quite name. The afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Dust particles floated in the golden beams, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost alive. The room smelled of old wood, cigarette smoke, and something faintly metallic, like copper or blood. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos. Cars honked, people shouted, vendors called out their wares. Life moved forward with the relentless momentum of time. But inside that room, time seemed to slow down, to bend, to wait, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what was about to happen. Robert Johnson sat in the corner, his guitar cradled against his chest like a secret, like a burden, like a child he both loved and feared. His eyes were fixed on a point in the room where nothing stood, at least nothing that anyone else could see. His fingers rested on the strings, but they didn't move. His breathing was shallow, measured, as if he were trying not to disturb something. The microphone waited, a cold, metallic sentinel standing between him and immortality. The wax disc was ready, spinning slowly, hungry for sound, ready to capture whatever vibrations passed through the air and transform them into permanent grooves that would outlive everyone in the room. But Johnson wouldn't move. He just kept staring at that empty corner, his lips moving slightly, forming words that produced no sound. It looked like he was listening to someone speak, or as if he were responding to a conversation only he could hear, a dialogue with the invisible, a negotiation with the unseen. The engineer, a man named Vincent, watched from behind the recording equipment. He was used to nervous musicians. He'd worked with plenty of them over the years in these temporary studios set up in hotel rooms and warehouses across the South. Some got stage fright, freezing when confronted with the microphone, suddenly unable to produce the magic they created so effortlessly in live performances. Some couldn't perform without a drink or two to steady their nerves, to quiet the voices of doubt. Some just needed encouragement. A few words of confidence, a reminder that they belonged here, that their music mattered. But this was different. Robert Johnson wasn't exhibiting the normal signs of performance anxiety. There was something in his posture, in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way his eyes refused to blink, in the set of his jaw that made Vincent uneasy. It wasn't nervousness. It was fear, or maybe it was reverence. Or maybe it was both twisted together into something Vincent had never seen before in all his years of recording artists. Vincent cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, we're ready when you are." His voice sounded too loud in the silence, too intrusive, like someone shouting in a library or a church. Robert didn't respond. He just kept staring, kept moving his lips in that silent conversation. Vincent looked at his assistant, a younger man named Charlie, who shrugged helplessly. They waited. Minutes passed. The light in the room shifted as the sun moved across the sky. The shadows grew longer, reaching across the floor like dark fingers. And still, Robert didn't move. The wax disc kept spinning, waiting, wasting time that cost money. Vincent was getting impatient, but something told him not to push too hard, Something in Robert's demeanor suggested that interrupting whatever was happening might be a mistake. Finally, Vincent stood up and walked over to him, his shoes creaking on the old wooden floor. "Mr. Johnson," he said again, softer this time, almost gentle. "Is everything all right?" Robert turned slowly, with the measured movement of someone pulling themselves back from somewhere far away. And when his eyes met Vincent's, the engineer took an involuntary step back. There was something in those eyes, something hollow and haunted, something that had seen too much and was trying desperately not to see more, something that suggested Robert Johnson was looking at two worlds simultaneously, the visible and the invisible, the natural and the supernatural, and finding no comfort in either. "Can't you hear him?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper, rough like gravel on dirt roads. Vincent frowned. Hear who? He listened, straining his ears for any sound besides the ambient noise of the city outside, the creak of the old building, the hum of the recording equipment. Nothing, just silence and the weight of Robert's question hanging in the air. Robert looked back at the empty corner, and his expression was one of weary resignation, of acceptance, of a man who had long ago given up trying to convince people of what he knew to be true. He's been following me since the crossroads, and he wants to be on this record too. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible almost, tangible. Vincent felt a chill crawl up his spine despite the warmth of the room, despite the Texas heat that made the warehouse feel like an oven. He glanced at the corner where Robert was staring with such intensity. There was nothing there, just walls, just shadows, just the ordinary geometry of an empty space defined by the intersection of plaster and wooden beams. But Robert was looking at it like it was occupied, like someone was standing there waiting, watching, like an audience of one was sitting in judgment of what was about to be recorded. "There's nobody there, Mr. Johnson," Vincent said gently. The way you might speak to a child afraid of the dark, the way you might try to soothe someone having a nightmare while awake. Robert smiled, but it was a sad smile, a knowing smile, a smile that carried the weight of too much experience and not enough hope. A smile that said he knew exactly how crazy he sounded and that the truth didn't change just because it sounded impossible. "I know you can't see him," Robert said quietly. "Nobody can, but he's there. He's always there. Ever since that night. Ever since I made the deal." Vincent didn't know what to say. He'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the blues world had heard the rumors about Robert Johnson and the crossroads. The whispers passed from musician to musician, from juke joint to juke joint. The legend of the man in black who appeared at midnight at the crossroads and offered impossible gifts for unthinkable prices. But Vincent had always dismissed them as folklore, as the kind of mythology that grows around talented people to explain away their genius, to make sense of abilities that seem to transcend human limitation. Now, standing in this room, looking into Robert's eyes, feeling the peculiar atmosphere that seemed to press down on everything, he wasn't so sure. What happened in those recording sessions has been debated for decades. Scholars have written dissertations examining every aspect of Robert Johnson's brief recording career. Musicians have offered theories ranging from the technical to the spiritual. Audio engineers have analyzed every frequency, every waveform, every microscopic detail captured in those old recordings, using technology that wouldn't exist for decades after Robert's death. Some say it was nerves, the natural anxiety of a man unused to formal recording environments, a man more comfortable playing in smoky juke joints where the audience was drunk and forgiving than in sterile studios where every mistake would be preserved forever. Others claim it was the weight of genius pressing down on a man too young to carry it, the burden of talent so immense it bordered on the supernatural, the knowledge that he had somehow accessed abilities that shouldn't be humanly possible. But there were those present, those who stood close enough to hear, those who watched Robert's face during those sessions, who swear that something else was in that room, something that whispered between the notes, something that bled into the grooves of every record Robert Johnson ever made, something that wanted to be heard but couldn't be seen. This is the story of the voice that followed him, the voice nobody else could hear, the voice that may still be calling from beyond the static, waiting in the silence between songs, living in the hiss and crackle of old wax recordings, embedded in the very fabric of the music. This is a story about genius and madness, about talent and terror, about the price of greatness and the cost of making deals you can never unmake. This is a story about Robert Johnson, the king of the Delta blues, and the presence that refused to let him sing alone. This is a story about what happens when ambition meets opportunity in the darkest possible way. This is a story about music that transcends the musician, about art that costs more than anyone should have to pay. The question we're asking today isn't whether Robert Johnson was talented. That much is undeniable. His influence on American music is immeasurable. Entire genres grew from the seeds he planted. Countless musicians have tried to capture even a fraction of what he achieved. The question is whether he was ever truly alone, whether the voice on those recordings belongs to one man or two. Whether the legend of the Crossroads is just a story, or whether it's a truth too strange to be dismissed, too consistent to be coincidence. And most importantly, whether that voice, that presence, that thing that followed Robert Johnson into every recording session is still out there, woven into the fabric of the music, waiting to be heard by anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen closely enough to hear what lies beneath the surface. Before we follow Robert Johnson into that studio, into the shadows where music and mystery become one, where the line between genius and possession blurs beyond recognition, make sure you're subscribed to Soul Chronicles. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the souls who touched the impossible, who reached beyond the veil and brought something back with them. Drop a comment and tell me which legend of the blues you want me to uncover next, because every story here carries a secret that refuses to stay silent. Every soul has a song, and every song has a shadow, and some shadows are longer than others. Robert Johnson didn't come into this world quietly, and he certainly didn't leave it that way. Born in May of 1911 in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, he entered a world that didn't want him, in a time that offered him nothing, in a place where simply existing as a black man was an act of defiance and danger that could end at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. His birth was complicated, marked by circumstances that would shape his entire identity and follow him like a curse or a prophecy. He was the product of an affair, born to Julia Major Dodds and a man named Noah Johnson, a plantation worker who disappeared from Robert's life before he could form memories of him, leaving behind only a name and a legacy of absence. In the rigid social structures of the Deep South, this made Robert an outsider from the beginning, not quite belonging to his mother's family who saw him as evidence of indiscretion, not quite accepted by his stepfather who raised him with resentment. A child caught between worlds, searching for a place to stand, for an identity to claim, for a purpose to justify his existence. The Deep South in the early 20th century was not just unforgiving. It was actively hostile, systematically cruel, designed from the ground up to crush the spirit of anyone born with dark skin. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't a distant past we can comfortably examine from a safe distance with the luxury of hindsight. This was a living nightmare, a daily reality of terror and humiliation and violence. Jim Crow laws governed every aspect of life, dictating where you could sit, where you could eat, where you could walk, who you could look at and how, what doors you could enter, what water fountains you could drink from. The rules were arbitrary and absolute. Breaking them, even accidentally, could be fatal. Lynchings were common, not just common but public. They were treated as community events, as entertainment, as social gatherings. Photographs of black bodies hanging from trees were turned into postcards and sold as souvenirs. Children were brought to watch, to learn the lessons that power wanted to teach, and the law did nothing. The law was often complicit. The law was often the ones holding the rope, wearing the badge, looking the other way. Poverty wasn't just a condition in this world. It was a landscape, an atmosphere, a constant crushing weight that made every day a battle for survival, every meal uncertain, every tomorrow a question mark. Sharecropping, the system that replaced slavery in name but not in practice, kept black families trapped in cycles of debt they could never escape no matter how hard they worked. You worked the land that someone else owned. You planted the seeds they provided. You harvested the crops under their supervision, under their control. And at the end of the season, after they took their cut for the land, for the seeds, for the tools, for the housing, for the credit they extended you at interest rates that would make a loan shark blush, for every arbitrary fee and charge they could invent, you were left with nothing, or less than nothing. You ended the year owing them more than you started with. And the cycle began again, tightening like a noose with every passing season. There was no escape. The system was designed to prevent escape. And if you tried, if you ran, if you refused to accept your place, there were consequences, swift and brutal consequences. Violence was ever present. Not just the spectacular violence of lynchings and riots, but the everyday violence of humiliation, of fear, of never knowing when a wrong word or a wrong look or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time might end your life or ruin your family. Black men were expected to step off the sidewalk when white people approached, to make themselves smaller, to demonstrate their inferiority with every gesture. They were expected to avert their eyes, to never meet the gaze of a white person directly, because that could be interpreted as challenge or disrespect. They were expected to accept insults, to tolerate abuse, to apologize for existing, to be grateful for any scrap of mercy or kindness shown to them. And if they didn't, if they showed even a hint of pride or resistance or basic human dignity, the consequences could be fatal, not just for them, but for their families, for their communities. One man's defiance could bring down collective punishment. Robert Johnson grew up in this environment. He breathed this air. He learned these rules before he could walk. He internalized the knowledge that his life was worth less than nothing in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the society that surrounded him and defined the boundaries of his existence. He learned to move through the world as a ghost, to be invisible when necessary, to swallow rage and humiliation and fear and transform them into something else. Something that could be expressed safely, something called the blues. In that world, music wasn't a luxury. It wasn't entertainment in the way we think of entertainment today, as something frivolous or optional or separate from the business of survival. It was a lifeline. It was a way to speak when words failed, when speaking openly could get you killed, when the truth was too dangerous to say aloud. It was a way to feel human when the world told you every day, in 1,000 different ways, large and small, that you weren't. It was a way to express rage without getting lynched for it. It was a way to express love in a world designed to beat the love out of you. It was a way to hold on to your soul when everything around you was trying to steal it, to crush it, to make you forget you ever had one. Music was resistance. Music was testimony. Music was survival. The blues was born in that soil, watered with sweat and blood and tears. It came from work songs sung in cotton fields, rhythms developed to coordinate the brutal labor, melodies that made the unbearable slightly more bearable, that gave structure to endless hours of backbreaking work under the merciless sun. It came from spirituals hummed in candlelit churches, prayers for deliverance sung by people who knew they probably wouldn't see freedom in this lifetime, but who held on to hope anyway, because hope was all they had. It came from the ache of a people trying to hold on to their souls in a world designed to strip them of their humanity, to reduce them to machines for producing wealth for others. The blues wasn't just music, it was testimony. It was history told by people who weren't allowed to write history books. It was resistance expressed in a form that couldn't be easily suppressed. It was survival transformed into art. And Robert Johnson, in his short, troubled, incandescent life, became one of its most haunting voices. His music carried all of that history, all of that pain, all of that rage and longing and desperate need to be heard. But before he was a legend, before the myth swallowed the man whole and transformed him into something larger than life, before his name became synonymous with genius and mystery and deals with the devil, he was just a kid, a scrawny teenager with big dreams and no discernible path to achieving them. A boy who wanted desperately to be noticed, to be respected, to be somebody in a world that was determined to make him nobody. A young man who looked at the established blues musicians with a mixture of admiration and envy, who wanted their respect more than anything, and who was willing to do whatever it took to get it. The established musicians of the Delta, men like Son House and Willie Brown and Charlie Patton, were the kings of this world. They commanded respect that transcended race and class. When they played, people listened. Black and white, rich and poor, everyone recognized genius when they heard it. When these men walked into a room, the atmosphere changed. Conversations stopped. Attention shifted. They had mastered the instrument, mastered the form, mastered the ability to take pain and longing and rage and transform it into something beautiful, something transcendent, something that made life worth living despite everything. Robert wanted that. He wanted it so badly it consumed him, drove him, defined every choice he made. But he didn't have it. Not yet. Not even close. When he tried to play with the older musicians, when he worked up the courage to ask if he could sit in during their sessions at house parties and juke joints, they laughed at him. Not cruelly necessarily, but dismissively. The kind of laughter that says, "You don't belong here. You're not ready. Come back when you've actually learned something." They told him to put the guitar down. They told him to stick to the harmonica, which he played adequately but not remarkably, competently but not memorably. They told him he was wasting his time, that some people just didn't have it, that talent couldn't be learned or earned or manufactured. And every time they turned him away, every time they shook their heads and went back to their playing, every time they made it clear he wasn't welcome, a little more desperation grew inside him, a little more hunger, a little more willingness to consider options that shouldn't be considered. Son House later recalled those early days in interviews conducted decades after Robert's death, when Son House himself had become a legendary figure, when people sought him out for stories about the old days, about the birth of the Delta blues. He said Robert was persistent. He'd give him that. The kid kept showing up, kept asking to play, kept fumbling through songs with more enthusiasm than skill, with more desire than ability. Son House said he felt bad for the kid sometimes. You could see the hunger in his eyes, the need, the desperation to prove himself. But hunger wasn't enough, desire wasn't enough, talent was what mattered. And Robert at that point didn't have it. Or at least that's what Son House thought. That's what everyone thought. That's what seemed obvious to anyone who heard him play. Then Robert disappeared. It happened suddenly, without announcement or explanation or goodbye. One day he was there, hanging around the edges of the music scene, pestering the older players, trying to learn, absorbing every note and every technique like a man dying of thirst. And the next day he was gone, vanished. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody knew why. His family didn't know where he was. His friends couldn't find him. His wife, if she even noticed he was gone, didn't know where to look for him. For 6 months, maybe more, maybe less, time gets fuzzy in the retelling and different accounts give different durations. Nobody saw Robert Johnson. He vanished into the vast, anonymous landscape of the Deep South, where a black man could walk for days without seeing anyone who knew his name, where you could lose yourself completely if that's what you wanted to do, where you could disappear and never be found. There are theories about where he went, stories and speculations that have grown and evolved over the decades. Some say he traveled south, down to Hazelhurst where he was born, looking for his biological father, trying to understand his roots, trying to find answers to questions about his identity that had haunted him since childhood. Others claim he wandered through the backroads of Mississippi and Louisiana, sleeping under bridges, playing his guitar for whoever would listen, slowly teaching himself in isolation what the other musicians wouldn't teach him, practicing until his fingers bled. Some whisper that he went looking for something specific. That he had heard the stories about the crossroads, about the man who appears at midnight, about the deals that could be made, and that he went searching for that crossroads, determined to find it, determined to make the trade, willing to pay any price for the ability he craved. The legend says there's a specific crossroads, Highways 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, midnight, a full moon or no moon, depending on who's telling the story. You stand at the center where the roads meet, where the four directions converge, where the veil between worlds is thinnest. And if your desire is strong enough, if your desperation is complete enough, if you're willing to pay the price, he appears. A tall man dressed in black, a man with no face or too many faces, or a face that changes depending on how you look at it. A man who speaks with a voice like gravel and honey and distant thunder. He takes your instrument, tunes it with fingers that move too fast to follow, plays a note that shouldn't be possible, and hands it back. And in that moment, the deal is sealed. You get the gift, the ability, the talent, everything you ever wanted. And he gets something in return, your soul, your life, your eternity. What we know for certain is that when Robert came back, everything had changed. He wasn't the fumbling kid anymore. He wasn't uncertain or clumsy or desperate in the way he had been. He played like a man possessed, like a man who had been taken apart and reassembled with new capabilities installed. His fingers moved across the strings with a speed and precision that defied explanation, that seemed physically impossible for someone who had been mediocre just months before. His voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone so young, a depth of emotion that suggested he'd lived several lifetimes in those missing months, that he'd seen things and done things and experienced things that aged him in ways that couldn't be seen but could be heard. He didn't just play the blues, he embodied it, he became it, he was it. His music carried a power that couldn't be taught or learned. It came from somewhere else, somewhere deep and dark and old. Son House heard him play after his return, and the experience shook him to his core. This was the same man who remembered laughing at Robert, who remembered telling him to give up, who remembered thinking the kid had no future in music and should probably focus his energy on something more realistic. And now here was Robert, playing circles around him, playing with a mastery that Son House had spent decades achieving through constant practice and performance. It wasn't natural, it wasn't possible. Human beings didn't improve that much that fast. The progression from incompetent to masterful required years of dedicated practice, thousands of hours, countless performances, gradual improvement through trial and error. And yet, it was happening right in front of him. Robert Johnson, the kid who couldn't play 6 months ago, was now the best blues guitarist Son House had ever heard. Better than him, better than anyone. Son House said something in an interview years later that would echo through blues history, that would become the foundation of the legend, that would transform Robert Johnson from a musician into a myth. He said it was as if Robert had been taught by someone who wasn't of this world, as if he had gone somewhere no living man should go and came back with a gift that carried a price, as if he had made a deal. And Son House wasn't the only one saying it. Other musicians who heard Robert play said the same thing. There was something unnatural about his ability, something that couldn't be explained by practice or study or natural talent, something that suggested Robert had accessed knowledge that shouldn't be accessible to human beings, that he had traded something precious for something powerful, that he had made a bargain with forces that don't make bargains lightly. That's when the rumors started. The whispers, the speculation, the legend of the crossroads began to spread through the Delta like wildfire, passed from musician to musician, from juke joint to juke joint, growing and mutating with each retelling until it became impossible to separate fact from fiction, reality from mythology. And with that legend came something else, something that only Robert seemed to notice. A presence, a voice, a shadow that never left his side. People who were close to him during this period noticed changes beyond just his musical ability. He had always been quiet, introspective, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, but now he was withdrawn to the point of isolation. He had always been thoughtful, but now he seemed haunted, pursued, looking over his shoulder at things that weren't there, or at things only he could see. He would stop mid-conversation and cock his head, as if listening to something no one else could hear, as if receiving instructions from an invisible presence. He would stare at empty corners of rooms for minutes at a time, his eyes tracking movement that didn't exist. He would refuse to sleep in certain places, claiming they felt wrong, claiming he could sense something there, some malevolent presence or watching entity. And when asked about it, when pressed about his transformation and his strange new behaviors, he would just smile that sad smile and change the subject. Or sometimes, in moments of weakness or exhaustion or maybe brutal honesty, he would hint at the truth. He would say things like, "I ain't alone no more," or "He's always listening," or "I paid the price, and now I gotta live with what I bought." But he never explained fully. He never laid it out clearly. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he'd been forbidden. Maybe he was afraid of what would happen if he told the truth. The first recording session happened in San Antonio, Texas, in late November of 1936. A man named Don Law, working for the American Record Corporation, had heard about this young bluesman tearing through the juke joints of Mississippi and Arkansas, leaving audiences stunned and other musicians jealous. Law was a talent scout, a man with an ear for raw, unpolished genius, a man who understood that the future of American music was being born in the Delta, in the poorest and most oppressed corners of the country, in places where pain was transformed into art out of sheer necessity. He'd heard about Robert Johnson from multiple sources, from different musicians who normally wouldn't agree on anything, but who all said the same thing about this kid. This kid was something special. This kid played like nobody else. This kid had something that couldn't be taught or learned, something that transcended technique and entered the realm of the supernatural. Law knew he had to capture it on record before someone else did, before Robert disappeared again, or before whatever gave him his ability decided to take it back. The session was held in a hotel room, the Gunter Hotel, converted into a temporary studio for the day. This was common practice at the time. Record companies couldn't afford to build permanent studios in every city, so they would travel with their equipment, setting up wherever they could find a quiet room with decent acoustics and electrical power. The Gunter Hotel room wasn't glamorous. It wasn't designed for music. It was just a room with a bed, a chair, some basic furniture, walls that had seen countless guests pass through and leave no trace of their existence. But it would do. It was quiet enough. The acoustics were acceptable. There were no sound booths, no advanced equipment, no multi-track recording capabilities that would become standard decades later. Just a microphone connected to a machine that would etch the sound directly onto a wax disc, capturing a single performance in permanent form with no ability to edit or correct mistakes. One take. That was it. If you messed up, you started over with a fresh disc. But something strange happened during that first session, something that Don Law mentioned in interviews years later, though he always hedged his words, always qualified his statements, always made it clear he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that superstitious nonsense, even as he described events that suggested otherwise. According to those who were there, according to the people who set up the equipment and witnessed what happened, Robert refused to face the microphone. This wasn't completely unusual. Some performers got nervous when confronted with the technology, with the mechanical ear that would preserve their performance forever. Some felt self-conscious, exposed, vulnerable. But Robert's refusal seemed different. It seemed rooted in something deeper than stage fright. When asked why he wanted to turn away, he said he didn't like people watching him. He said it made him nervous. Fair enough, Don Law thought. He'd worked with shy performers before, with artists who needed specific conditions to create their best work. So they let Robert turn toward the wall, playing into the corner of the room, his back to the microphone and the people in the room. But one of the engineers, a man whose name has been lost to history or was never recorded in the first place, later recalled that it wasn't nervousness in Robert's eyes when he positioned himself. He'd seen nervous performers. He'd worked with artists who were terrified of recording, who froze or forgot their lyrics or couldn't perform under pressure. This wasn't that. There was something closer to fear in the way Robert positioned himself, a deep primal fear that went beyond stage fright. Or maybe it was obedience, the way a soldier follows orders or a servant performs a task. The engineer watched as Robert settled into position, watched as Robert's eyes scanned the corner of the room where he was facing, watched as Robert's lips moved silently before he started playing, forming words that produced no sound. It looked like Robert was asking permission, or maybe reporting for duty, or maybe negotiating terms. The engineer mentioned this observation to Don Law, who dismissed it. Artists were temperamental. Artists had quirks and rituals and superstitions. As long as Robert could play, as long as the music got captured on the disc, nothing else mattered. The recording began. Robert's fingers found the strings, and suddenly the room was filled with sound unlike anything Don Law had heard before. It was raw and immediate and intimate, more powerful than any live performance because of the proximity, because of the way the microphone captured every nuance and detail. It felt like Robert was playing inside your chest, like his voice was coming from inside your own head, like his emotions were your emotions. The guitar work was intricate, complex, with Robert playing bass lines and melodies simultaneously in a way that shouldn't have been possible for one person with two hands. It sounded like two guitars or three, layered and interweaving in patterns that were too sophisticated for someone who had supposedly just learned to play. And his voice, my God, his voice. It carried so much emotion, so much lived experience, so much pain and longing and rage and hope, all tangled together into something that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the soul. Don Law knew immediately from the first note that he had found something special. This wasn't just another blues singer. This was history being made. This was the future of music being born in a hotel room in San Antonio. But during the playback, something odd happened. Something that made everyone in the room pause and look at each other with expressions of confusion and unease. They gathered around the recording equipment to listen to what they'd captured, to make sure the sound quality was acceptable, to determine if they had a usable take or needed to record again. The technology was primitive by modern standards. The sound quality was lo-fi, filled with hiss and crackle and the various imperfections inherent in wax recording. Every ambient sound got captured. The creaks of the hotel's old wooden frame, the rustle of fabric, the sound of breathing. But through all of that noise, Robert's voice and guitar came through clear enough to sell, clear enough to matter, clear enough to change music history. Don Law was satisfied. He was about to tell Robert they had a good take and could move on to the next song when one of the engineers held up his hand. "Wait," he said. "Listen to that." He rewound the wax disc and played a specific section again, increasing the volume slightly. "There," he said, pointing at nothing. "You hear that?" Don Law leaned in closer, his ear near the speaker. At first he didn't hear anything unusual. Just Robert's voice, just Robert's guitar, just the normal background noise of a room being recorded. But then, if you listened very carefully, if you isolated a specific frequency range in your mind, if you paid attention to the spaces between the notes rather than the notes themselves, there was something else. A faint sound in the background, barely audible, easy to dismiss as nothing. It could have been a lot of things. The creak of the hotel's old wooden frame settling in the afternoon heat. The whisper of wind through a crack in the window. The rustle of Robert's clothing as he moved while playing. Audio recording is imperfect, especially with 1930s technology. It captures everything. Every ambient sound, every stray noise, every acoustic accident, this was probably nothing, just an artifact of the recording process. Just random noise that the microphone picked up and preserved. But the engineer who had noticed it wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He played the section again, adjusting the playback settings, trying to isolate the sound. "It almost sounds like a voice," he said, his expression uncertain, like someone who isn't sure whether to trust their own ears. "Listen, right there. It's like someone's singing along, but really quiet, underneath everything else. Like harmony that isn't supposed to be there." They listened again, and now that he'd mentioned it, now that the suggestion had been planted, now that they were listening specifically for it, it was hard not to hear it. There was a pattern to the sound, a rhythm, a musical quality. It rose and fell in a way that seemed intentional rather than random, that seemed purposeful, that seemed like someone was deliberately adding another layer to the recording. It could have been Robert himself, humming along as he played, creating harmonies with his own voice, adding depth to the performance. Musicians did that sometimes. It wasn't uncommon. But Robert was in the room with them now, standing just a few feet away, and when they asked him about it, when they pointed out the sound and asked if he'd been humming during the take, he went pale. The color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. "That's him," Robert said quietly, his voice barely audible, almost swallowed by the ambient noise of the hotel. He was staring at the floor, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. He said he'd be on every record. He said I could never sing alone again. He said that was part of the deal, that he gets to be heard too. That's the price. The room went silent. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew how to respond to that statement. Don Law assumed it was a joke, some kind of blues musician mystique, playing up the mythology for effect, creating a story that would help market the records. He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "That's good, Robert. Very atmospheric, very mysterious. Hell, it might even help sell records if people think there's something supernatural about them. The mysterious blues man with the haunted recordings. That could work." But Robert wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't playing along with the joke. He just kept staring at the floor, his hands trembling slightly, looking like a man who had said too much and was already regretting it, looking like a man who had broken a rule and was waiting for punishment. Nobody understood what he meant. They couldn't understand it because they hadn't been where Robert had been, hadn't seen what Robert had seen, hadn't made the deals Robert had made. They assumed it was the ramblings of a man too deep in his own head, an artist who had spent too much time alone with his thoughts and his music, someone who had constructed elaborate mythologies to explain his own talent because accepting that he was simply gifted felt too mundane. The blues attracted intense people, tortured people, people who felt things too deeply and thought too much and saw patterns where others saw randomness. Robert was probably just playing a character, creating a persona, building a legend around himself. That made sense. That was easier to believe than the alternative. That was easier to accept than the possibility that something genuinely strange was happening, that the legends were true, that deals could actually be made with forces beyond human understanding. But the sound was there, captured on the wax disc, permanent, undeniable, faint, almost imperceptible, easy to miss if you weren't listening specifically for it. But there, and once you heard it, once you became aware of its existence, once you tuned your ear to that specific frequency, you couldn't unhear it. It was like a second voice hiding beneath the first, singing harmony to a melody only it understood. Or maybe singing the original melody, and Robert was the one providing harmony. Or maybe singing something entirely different, a counterpoint that existed in a different key, a different rhythm, a different reality. It was impossible to tell. The sound defied analysis. It seemed to shift depending on how you listened to it, revealing different aspects to different listeners, hiding and revealing itself according to rules that made no sense. They recorded multiple songs that day in San Antonio. Robert was prolific, moving from one song to the next with minimal rest, as if he were trying to capture everything before something stopped him, before the ability left him, or before he was prevented from continuing. He recorded Kind-Hearted Woman Blues, I Believe I'll Dust My Broom, Sweet Home Chicago, Ramblin' on My Mind. Each one was brilliant. Each one showcased a different aspect of his talent, his technical skill, his emotional depth, his ability to take traditional blues forms and twist them into something new, something personal, something that bore his unique signature. And on each one, if you listened carefully, if you paid attention to the spaces between the notes, if you tuned your ear to that specific frequency, that faint sound was there, that whisper, that presence, that voice that shouldn't exist but somehow does. Don Law and his team noticed it on some takes more than others, but they attributed it to the limitations of the recording equipment, to the acoustic properties of the hotel room, to any number of rational, mundane explanations. They didn't think about it too much. They didn't dwell on the mystery. They had what they came for. They had Robert Johnson on record. That's what mattered. Everything else was just interesting footnotes. But after the session ended, after Robert had been paid his modest fee and had left the hotel, after the equipment had been partially packed up, one of the engineers stayed behind. He couldn't stop thinking about that sound, about what Robert had said, about the look in Robert's eyes when he said it, the look of a man telling the truth about something unbelievable. The engineer, whose name might have been George or Henry or something common that history forgot to preserve, set up the equipment again and played through the recordings one more time. Alone in the hotel room, as the afternoon light faded and shadows crept across the walls, as the city outside began its transition from day to night, he listened, really listened. Not as a technician checking for quality, but as a person trying to understand what he was hearing. And what he heard made him pack up the equipment quickly and leave. Made him want to get out of that room as fast as possible. Made him question things he thought he understood about the nature of reality. He never talked about it publicly. He never went on record with his experience. He never gave interviews about those recording sessions. But he told his family years later, on his deathbed when he had nothing to lose and no reason to lie, that he had heard something in those recordings that convinced him there were things in the world that couldn't be explained by science or reason. He said he had heard a voice that wasn't Robert's, a voice that seemed to be coming from somewhere else, somewhere far away or deep inside, somewhere that shouldn't exist according to any map or geography he understood. He said the voice was singing words he couldn't quite make out, in a language he didn't quite recognize, with a melody that felt ancient and alien and somehow familiar all at once. And he said that when he realized what he was hearing, when the full implication of it hit him like a physical blow, he felt a cold terror, unlike anything he'd experienced before or since. A primal fear that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some ancient part of his brain that still remembered when humans were prey. He said he knew, with absolute certainty that transcended logic or proof, that he was hearing something that was never meant to be heard by human ears. Something that had slipped through the cracks of reality and gotten itself recorded by accident. Or maybe not by accident. Maybe it wanted to be recorded. Maybe it needed to be recorded. Maybe that was the whole point of the deal, to be heard, to be preserved, to exist beyond its original form. The second session happened a year later, in November of 1937, back in Dallas, in that warehouse on the 3rd floor where we began this story. By then, Robert had become a more seasoned performer, traveling throughout the South, building a reputation that preceded him, playing in juke joints and house parties and anywhere that would have him. The records from the San Antonio session had been released, pressed onto 78 RPM discs, and distributed to stores that catered to black audiences. They didn't sell in huge numbers. The blues was still niche music, still regional, still considered too raw and unpolished for mainstream white audiences who preferred their music sanitized and safe. But within the community, within the world of blues musicians and aficionados, within the network of people who understood what the blues represented and why it mattered, Robert's records were noticed. People talked about them. People recognized that something special had been captured. They could hear the genius, even if they couldn't explain it. They could feel the power, even if they couldn't articulate its source. But those who knew Robert personally, those who traveled with him or played with him or spent time in his company, noticed a change. He had always been quiet, introspective, the type to observe rather than participate in loud conversations. But now he was withdrawn to the point of isolation. He would sit in corners at parties, not playing, not engaging, just watching and listening, and seeming to be somewhere else entirely. He had always been thoughtful, but now he seemed haunted, pursued, looking over his shoulder at things that weren't there, or at things only he could see. He drank more. He, not just socially, not just for enjoyment, but desperately, compulsively, as if trying to drown something that wouldn't drown, something that could swim through alcohol and still surface intact. He avoided mirrors. This was noticed by multiple people, commented on, wondered about. When asked about this unusual behavior, he would make jokes about vanity or superstition, deflecting with humor that didn't reach his eyes. But people noticed that he genuinely seemed uncomfortable with his own reflection. He would turn mirrors to face the wall in hotel rooms. He would angle himself away from shop windows that might catch his image. He would refuse to look at photographs of himself. It was as if he didn't want to see himself, or as if he was afraid of what else might appear in the reflection behind him. What else might be there, standing just out of frame, watching over his shoulder. He would stop mid-sentence during conversations and turn his head sharply, suddenly, as if hearing something no one else could hear, as if responding to a sound that only reached his ears. His friends would ask him what was wrong, what he'd heard, why he'd stopped talking, and he would just shake his head and say, "Nothing. Thought I heard something." It's nothing. But it happened too often to be nothing. It happened with too much consistency, too much urgency, too much visible reaction for it to be random or imagined. And sometimes, when it happened, Robert's expression would change in ways that were disturbing to watch. The fear would be replaced by resignation or acceptance, or the weary exhaustion of someone who has given up fighting, someone who has learned that resistance is futile and that the only option is to endure. His friends would ask him what was bothering him, what had changed since the crossroads, since the transformation, since he'd come back playing like a different person. They knew something had happened. Everyone knew something had happened. The change was too dramatic, too complete, too sudden to be natural. And Robert, in moments of weakness or exhaustion, or maybe just desperate need to tell someone, would hint at the truth. He would let small pieces slip through his defenses. He would say things like, "He's getting louder. I could barely hear him at first, just a whisper in the back of my mind. But now, he's almost as loud as I am. Sometimes I can't tell which thoughts are mine and which are his." When pressed to explain who he was, when people asked for clarification or details, Robert would retreat into vague statements or silence. He would change the subject or make a joke, or suddenly remember he needed to be somewhere else. But occasionally, very occasionally, in moments when his guard was down, when he was drunk enough or tired enough or honest enough, he would be more direct. He would say, "The man at the crossroads, the tall man in black, he gave me the music, but he kept a piece of me. And every time I play, he gets stronger. Every time I perform, he takes a little more. Every recording captures more of him and less of me. And one day there won't be any me left, just him playing through a body that used to be mine. People didn't know what to make of these statements. They sounded like the ravings of someone losing their grip on reality, someone descending into madness or paranoia. The blues life was hard. The constant travel, the poverty, the racial terror, the violence that was always just one wrong look away. It could break people, it could drive them to drink, to drugs, to insanity. Maybe that's what was happening to Robert. Maybe the pressure of his sudden success, combined with the grinding reality of being a black man in the South, was breaking his mind. That seemed more likely than the alternative. That seemed more rational than believing that something supernatural was actually happening. In that Dallas session, the strange occurrences intensified. The atmosphere was different from the beginning. Robert arrived late, visibly shaken, his clothes disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and darting. His hands were trembling, not just nervous trembling, but violent shaking, like someone suffering from withdrawal or shock. He kept glancing over his shoulder, even though the door was closed and locked and no one else was in the hallway outside. Vincent, the engineer, asked if he was all right, if he needed some time before they started, if maybe they should reschedule. But Robert shook his head. "We need to do this now," he said, "before he changes his mind. Before the deal changes." Vincent didn't understand what that meant, but Robert's urgency was clear. The engineers set up the equipment, the same makeshift studio arrangement they'd used before. And once again, Robert turned toward the wall. But this time, before he started playing, he whispered something. One of the men standing nearby, a young assistant named Charlie, swore he heard Robert say, "I know you're here, I can feel you. Just let me finish this one clean, please. Just give me one recording that's mine." His voice was plaintive, begging, the voice of someone negotiating with power they don't understand and can't control. The recording began. Robert's voice was raw, aching, filled with a longing that seemed to reach beyond the room, beyond the moment, beyond the physical world, into something eternal and infinite. But halfway through the take, something happened. Robert stopped playing completely, suddenly. He didn't miss a note, he didn't fumble or hesitate. He just stopped, his hands frozen on the strings, his eyes locked on that same empty corner, his entire body rigid, as if paralyzed. The engineer called out, asking if he was all right, asking if something was wrong with the guitar or the room or the microphone. Robert didn't respond. He just sat there staring, his breathing shallow and rapid, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested panic or terror. Then, slowly, he whispered, barely audible. He said, "I'm doing it wrong." He said, "I need to play it his way." He said, "If I don't, he'll take it all back, everything, the talent, the music, all of it." No one knew what to say. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Finally, Robert started again, and this time, he played the song differently. Faster, darker, more aggressive. The melody twisted in ways that didn't make sense according to traditional blues structure, yet somehow felt inevitable, felt right in a way that transcended theory and entered the realm of pure instinct. The rhythm was off, syncopated in strange places, creating a sense of unease and disorientation. When he finished, he looked exhausted, drained, as if the song had taken something vital from him, as if playing it had cost him more than just physical energy. He slumped in his chair, the guitar nearly slipping from his lap. The engineers rushed to steady him. They played it back, and once again there was that sound, but this time it was louder, more distinct, harder to dismiss as background noise or recording artifacts. It sounded like humming, or chanting, or singing in a language no one recognized. A low, rhythmic sound that pulsed beneath Robert's voice like a second heartbeat. Ernie Ertl, one of the engineers, later spoke about that session in an interview decades after Robert's death, when he was an old man with nothing to lose and no reputation to protect. He said he never believed in ghosts or spirits or any of that superstitious nonsense. He was a man of science, a technician who understood sound as physics, as vibrations traveling through air and being captured by machines. But he couldn't explain what he heard in those recordings. He couldn't rationalize it away or attribute it to technical failures. He said it was like listening to two people singing at once, but only one of them was alive. One voice came from Robert's body. The other came from somewhere else, somewhere that shouldn't have access to the physical world, but somehow did. He said that when he looked at Robert during those sessions, he saw a man who was terrified of his own voice, a man who flinched when he hit certain notes, a man who seemed to be fighting a battle with himself, or with something inside himself, with every word he sang. He said the atmosphere in that room was wrong. It felt watched. It felt crowded despite there only being a handful of people present. It felt like there were more presences than visible bodies. And he said that after the session ended, after Robert had left and they were packing up the equipment, he noticed something on the wax disc, a pattern in the grooves that shouldn't have been there. A section where the grooves seemed to spiral in the wrong direction, or loop back on themselves, or create shapes that looked almost intentional, almost like symbols. He mentioned it to the other engineers, but they dismissed it. Wax discs were imperfect. Manufacturing defects happened. It didn't mean anything. Robert recorded a total of 29 songs across those 2 sessions. 29 songs over 2 days, spread across a year. 29 songs that would go on to define the Delta blues, that would influence generations of musicians, that would become the foundation for rock and roll and countless other genres. Songs like Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, Love in Vain, Sweet Home Chicago, Me and the Devil Blues, each one a masterpiece, each one carrying a weight and power that transcended the sum of its technical components. From Muddy Waters to Eric Clapton, to the Rolling Stones, to Led Zeppelin, to every blues-influenced musician who came after, Robert Johnson's influence is undeniable and immeasurable. His 29 songs became the blueprint, the template, the foundation upon which entire careers were built. But those who listened closely, those who paid attention to the spaces between the notes, those who tuned their ears to frequencies that most people ignored, claimed there was always something else there, a presence, a whisper, a voice that didn't belong, a companion that nobody invited but everyone could sense if they paid attention. And as modern technology improved, as audio engineers gained new tools to analyze old recordings, some of them began to find things they couldn't explain, things that shouldn't be possible given the limitations of 1930s recording technology. Over the years, audio engineers and music historians have analyzed those recordings with modern technology, using tools and techniques that wouldn't exist for decades after the original sessions. They've isolated tracks in ways that weren't possible when the recordings were made. They've filtered out background noise using digital algorithms. They've amplified specific frequencies that weren't meant to be heard, that were buried beneath layers of hiss and crackle, and some of them have found things that challenge their understanding of what should be possible. Patterns in the static, words hidden beneath the guitar strings. A low, rhythmic chant that seems to pulse through certain songs, almost like a heartbeat, maintaining a tempo that doesn't quite match Robert's playing. Some dismiss it as audio artifacts, the natural degradation of old wax recordings, the result of decades of copying and recopying and transferring from one medium to another. Each generation of copying introduces new noise, new distortions, new phantom sounds. That's the rational explanation. That's what science would tell us. But others aren't so sure. They point out that the patterns are too consistent, that the same sounds appear on multiple recordings made at different times in different locations, that the voice, if that's what it is, seems to interact with Robert's playing in ways that suggest intelligence and intent rather than random noise, that it harmonizes in ways that should require musical knowledge and ability, that it responds to the emotional content of the songs, becoming more prominent during intense moments and receding during quieter passages. These aren't the characteristics of random noise or degradation artifacts. These are the characteristics of a conscious presence participating in the performance. In the end, we're left with 29 songs, 29 recordings that change music history forever, 29 pieces of evidence that something extraordinary happened in those 2 sessions. We're left with a voice that echoes through time, carrying with it the weight of legend, the shadow of the supernatural, and the undeniable genius of a man who transformed the blues. But we're also left with questions, with mysteries that refuse to be solved, with testimonies from engineers and musicians and listeners who all heard something they couldn't explain. Maybe it's all just myth. Maybe the voice is nothing more than audio degradation and the power of suggestion. Maybe Robert Johnson was simply a genius who practiced in isolation and emerged transformed by dedication alone. Or maybe, just maybe, there's truth buried beneath the legend. Maybe he really did make a deal at the crossroads. Maybe he really was followed by something that wanted to be heard. Maybe the voice is real. Robert Johnson's music endures because it speaks to something primal in all of us. It speaks to loss and longing and the ache of being human. But it also speaks to mystery, to the things we can't explain, to the possibility that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. And somewhere in that mystery, in the spaces between the notes, in the silence before and after the songs, there's a voice that nobody else could hear but that everyone can feel. A voice that followed Robert Johnson into every recording. A voice that may still be waiting in those old grooves, ready to speak to anyone brave enough to listen. So the next time you play Crossroad Blues or Hellhound on My Trail, pay attention, not just to the words, not just to the guitar, but to what lies beneath, to the whisper in the static, to the presence in the silence, because that's where the real story lives. That's where the voice waits, and once you hear it, you'll never listen to Robert Johnson the same way again. If this story sent a chill down your spine, hit that like button and subscribe to Soul Chronicles. Share this with someone who loves the blues or someone brave enough to hear the truth. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Was it genius or something darker? Because here on Soul Chronicles, every soul has a song and every song has a secret. And some secrets refuse to stay silent.